Well, good day, everybody. It's a nice, beautiful autumn morning here in Albuquerque, and I'm sitting out on my front patio. This is the Writer Plus, and I'm going to sit here and work on a story idea. Yeah, I have an idea. Yeah, so the Writer Plus works a lot like the AlphaSmart Neo. Press a button, it comes on. It's powered by 3 AA batteries, which have a life of roughly 300 or so hours, they say, which is about what the AlphaSmart was rated at. So, what is my project about? Well, that's a good question. I had this idea this morning. What would it be like if sometime in the near future, all digital photography ceased? At least the manufacture of new equipment, because of some dramatic events happening in the world, especially in Asia and in the world economy, and people had to go back to square one. They had to figure out light-sensitive chemical emulsions and how to make them by hand. Like maybe it would start out with cyanotype all over again, like Sir William Herschel pioneered in the early 19th century, something like that. So I'm kind of want to work on a little treatment for that concept, and that's what I'm out here for. Well, first I hit the power button, and then what comes on is a splash screen, and it wants me to select the folder keys 1 through 8. And I've already renamed F2 button Starting Over is the name of my project, so I hit F2. And there is the document in here called Starting Over. If I hit Enter, I'll go right into the document, and this is the start of the piece that I'm going to be writing here. So now if I hit the Escape key, I will exit out of the actual document itself back into the F2 folder itself. And so you can put multiple named files within each of the function key buttons. So this is the overall file itself, F2, I've named Starting Over, and in that I have the initial document called Starting Over, but I could create another document that may have like notes for the project or maybe ideas for historical timeline or whatever, right? So you have this nested files within folders kind of capability with the function keys on the Writer Plus. I should also mention that there's also another 8 function keys, 9 through 16, that you can access here. So you actually have 16 of these function folders that you can have documents in. Okay, back to my Starting Over, and hit Enter on that one, and back to the document. And let's continue writing. Well, I don't really plan these projects out very well like a professional writer would. I just kind of sit down, inspired by an idea, and start at the beginning with a character. I got to immediately come up with a name and kind of a venue. And, you know, by default, it seems like the last few years I kind of defaulted to this imaginary world of the Loser's Blend coffee shop world. But it's a little different now in this scenario. This is some kind of a post-apocalyptic scenario. There's fallout storms, and people carry gas masks and fallout suits in their backpacks, but image-making devices are strictly forbidden. Only the regime has image-making devices, and this character who heads out the coffee shop door that used to be Loser's Blend coffee shop years ago, inside of his backpack, underneath a pile of dirty clothes, which he's hoping a security patrol won't dig through too deeply if they stop him. Underneath his dirty clothes is a homemade camera.
It was another stormy day, dust and debris blowing about, with a forecast for level 3 fallout later. Simpson pulled his collar up as he headed out the door to the dark clank of the brass bell overhead. It used to be a bright-sounding ring, he remembered, years ago when it was known as Loser's Blend, the best coffee in town. Coffee, if only. He had his mask and fallout pullover in the backpack, just in case, along with the box camera tucked away under a wad of dirty clothes. The patrols weren't as common now, but you didn't want to get caught with contraband image-making gear. The consequences were too extreme to think about. Just keep your head down and be a patriotic comrade, or so the torn posters, flapping in the wind, suggested. The calculus of disobedience demanded it be worth losing your life over, he'd decided. How badly does a person want to do something if it meant getting caught would result in a torturous death? You'd absolutely have no choice. It would have to be something you couldn't not do, a compulsion building up for years, then some initial foray into addressing the urge, scratching the itch, hoping to satiate the compulsion, only to find the scratching makes the itch stronger, the compulsion more urgent. That's how Simpson ended up reinventing chemical photography in an age when only regimes and their corporate toadies had cameras. Simpson lived in a makeshift flat above a decrepit automobile repair garage, whose owner, Devaney, was a longtime friend he'd learned to trust only after years of a tenuous relationship marked by weaving and dodging like prize fighters training for some match that would never come. Petrol cars hadn't been manufactured since before the Troubles, but they were at least repairable, unlike the electric cars that had once been ubiquitous but were now scrapped for their lithium to fuel a new generation of thermonuclear weapons. Simpson wasn't supposed to know that either, but he had context and could think for himself. And also, he had something else. The archive, he called it. Simpson pedaled home on his pneumatic cycle, a cobbled-together assemblage of pre-Troubles Marin County mountain bike, a high-pressure accumulator salvaged from a crashed SpaceX drone ship, and a single-cylinder Italian scooter engine, highly modified by Devaney to run on compressed air, which he got for next to nothing from the garage, in exchange for certain special technical services. Simpson pedal-assisted through miles of ramshackle dwellings that reminded him of photos of third-world slums he'd seen in the archives. The irony not lost on him that his was once considered a first-world economy, but now could scarcely be any different from what was portrayed in those long-ago photos. He cut through a narrow alley and dismounted to carry the bike across a steep culvert and across a makeshift bridge built onto an old gas pipeline, all to avoid a sector claimed by the Jumper Kings, a paramilitary gang allied to an undercover division of the Interior Secretariat, whose mission was to maintain social order through the threat of constant upheaval and terrorism. The Jumpers were just toadies, he knew, but dangerous for their regime alliance, a ticket to get away with literal murder, or worse. Simpson pedal-assisted up the alley and paused in an alcove to cut off the bike's air valve, then listened intently. Observation was his ken, using all his natural senses, plus others he'd learned to nurture. The incessant wind, a background howl that fluttered loose panels and bent scraggly branches with a hiss. A distant patrol siren, Dopplering in the distance. The pop-pop-pop of weapons fire on the wind, shrieks of voices carried from somewhere afar, and nearby, the bang of a window shutter oscillating between two end states, open and shut and open again, revealing muffled voices from within. Simpson crept closer, until he was at the back of the garage, next to the dented armored door, just underneath the small window of Devaney's office. One voice was Devaney's. The other two he didn't recognize except for their crisp enunciations, the kind he knew from the Perez, ingrained through rigorous training to communicate with maximum efficiency in the briefest time. Perez, special ops, in old speak, from what he'd read in the archives, not welcome visitors. Suddenly, the scrape of an overturned chair, raised voices, the muffled thud of truncheon upon flesh and bone, then a distant slam of the garage's front door, and silence, except for the sobbing moans of Devaney.
Well, I'm ready for section 3 of my story. I don't know how long this story's going to go for, how it's going to end, what the plot's going to entail. I'm just writing it, just inspired to write it. And I think That's what you need to do when you have the urge to create. Just sit down and start writing. Start building that story. Start creating that world. But in the meantime, I wish you guys the very best. Stay well and stay creative. Bye-bye for now.